just been connected to the largest spiritual network on the planet, The Jeffrey Daugherty Show.
Jeffrey Daugherty.
Sink or swim, deep end information, parabiblical research, spiritual technologies, personal empowerment. Be your own guru. Guide your own spirit. Master your own ascension. And now, showing you how, here's Jeffrey Daugherty.
Well, hello there, Jeffrey Daugherty, Christian whistleblower, with another show for you today, continuing on where we left off yesterday. If you listened to yesterday's show, you know. If you didn't, you need to go back and check it out. We talked about how Alexander the Great was front and center in the development of the Jewish culture into which Jesus was born and which Jesus understood and to a very large degree rebelled against. So it's very, very important to understand the influence of Alexander the Great on Jewish culture. In fact, we talked about Judaism and Christianity. If you want to talk about pure Judaism or pure Christianity, it's the same thing as talking about a purebred mutt. They do not exist. Judaism, a blend of Egyptian, Babylonian, Greco-Roman culture and spiritual influences, among others. And of course, Christianity, being Judaic in nature and base, you can add on to those influences and the influences of the many religions and cultures from which Christianity robbed as it marauded across the globe, converting people, quote unquote, at the edge of the sword. We're looking out of my book, Apostle Paul Antichrist. The original book was 354 pages. I've just released a new updated version, 410 pages, complete with footnotes and fully annotated. It's available at imnck.com, imnck.com. And moving from Alexander the Great, who was the first character in the book, moving into chapter 2, we look at Gamaliel. Now, who in the world was Gamaliel, and why in the world should we care? Well, Gamaliel was known as the greatest living Jewish rabbi of the day. In fact, he is revered and regarded as one of the great Jewish rabbis of all time. And it's very important because he was a rabbi in Jerusalem during the time where Jesus was a boy and during the time where Saul of Tarsus, who would later come to proclaim himself the Apostle Paul and become popularly known as such, he was also in Jerusalem. We know in Acts chapter 22, verse number 3, Paul himself makes the claim that he was a student of Gamaliel. Gamaliel only taught in the temple, and that goes on to talk about something else we'll look at in the days to come. How could Paul, a Roman citizen, be invited into the very inner sanctum of all things Jewish and study under the greatest Jewish rabbi of the day? I mean, think about that. Here's this guy who's a Roman citizen. You can imagine the suspicion and the enmity between people of Jewish heritage and Roman heritage. In fact, if you were Jewish and you didn't mind your P's and Q's, you could wind up in the Colosseum in Rome and not as a spectator, if you know what I mean. And of course, Jews were banished from Rome, and there was just a lot of hatred. And to think that a Jewish citizen from birth, as Paul also claimed in the book of Acts, was able to get in and study under Gamaliel, well, that really should start some questions popping up in your mind and have you going, I wonder about that. Now, there's another story in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where Jesus, as a child, about 12, 13 years old, and I relate this in the book, where Jesus was left behind one Passover by his family, unintentionally so. And you've all heard this story. While Jesus was there, he was talking doctrine with the priests, with the scribes, with the Pharisees. Here was Jesus, 12, 13 years old, debating doctrine with these doctors of religion, and the New Testament records that they were all very, very impressed with his knowledge and with his expertise in the law, in history. No doubt they also talked about philosophy. They were most impressed by Jesus. And keep in mind, folks, this was Passover. Passover. And at Passover, all the Jews were required to come to Jerusalem and take part in the Passover ceremonies. So everybody that was somebody in Judaism, and even everybody that was nobody in Judaism, if you were Jewish, you were there. So obviously, Jesus was there, we know from the New Testament record. Obviously, Gamaliel, as one of the leading rabbis, was there. And Paul, Saul of Tarsus, and Jesus, both being about the same age, Paul would have been there, if for no other reason, because it was Passover, but Paul would have been there also because at that time, that was about the age he was when he studied under Gamaliel. Some of you are starting to see where I'm going with this, and it's fascinating. It's astounding. It's very, very interesting. So if Jesus was in Jerusalem, as the New Testament tells us he was, and if he was debating doctrine with the teachers of the law, as the New Testament tells us he was, then that means that Jesus was debating doctrine and talking about doctrine with Gamaliel, who was, the New Testament tells us, Paul's teacher. Paul was a Jew. He would have been in Rome, and it would have been highly unusual and highly unlikely that he would not have been there with Gamaliel in Jerusalem. I think I might have said Rome. In Jerusalem, in Passover. Ergo, it would be far more likely than not likely that Jesus and Paul at least had a passing acquaintance or meeting in Jerusalem. How in the world could somebody like Paul, the avid student, the huge ego, the seeker of truth, the one who was zealous for the law above his fellows, depending upon which, if it's the Paul that you think of, great love for the truth, man that loved the Bible and teaching. Do you think that if there was a boy his age that was debating with the priests and the rabbis, and it was of such renown that this kid was able to hold his own with him, do you think that anything could have kept Paul, actually then Saul of Tarsus, from being at that meeting, or at least having witnessed it? Could anything have kept him from meeting this boy who was able to debate with his own teacher? Could anything have kept him from being involved in that conversation? Yes, some things could have, but it's far more unlikely that Paul was not there than it is that Paul was there. It takes much more faith to believe that Paul was not there than it does to believe that Paul was there. I submit to you, and I've written in the book, Apostle Paul Antichrist, forwarded by George Norrie, by the way, that Paul, Saul of Tarsus, and Jesus did in fact meet in the temple when Jesus was debating doctrine during Passover with Paul's very teacher. Now, you can tell me that during Passover there was a kid debating with Paul's teacher and getting the best of him, and Paul wasn't interested. You can believe that if you want. But my. Don't ever accuse me of not being realistic. So what does this mean? I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that Paul and Jesus met as children there in the temple when Jesus was debating with the priests. And I think that you have to admit that, wow, that's some super strong circumstantial evidence. Paul said Gamaliel was my teacher. Scripture says that Jesus talked with Gamaliel. All Jews had to be in Jerusalem for Passover. Paul was a Jew. Paul was a student of Gamaliel. Brother, don't tell me he wasn't there, because Jesus was hanging out not for minutes, not for hours, but Jesus was there for days, debating with these priests, among whom Gamaliel was undoubtedly one, and to believe that he debated for days, folks, days, and Paul didn't show up. You got to really want to believe that, and really want to squash truth, and really bury your hand deep in the ostrich sand to believe that one. It's much more logical, it's much more rational to believe that Jesus and Paul must have had at least a passing meeting. And I extrapolate that Jesus was the center of attention in that meeting. Unquestionably. The New Testament declares it to be so. Jesus was probably the center of attention of all the religious people in Jerusalem that year at Passover. 13 years old, debating with the priests for days and holding his own. How do you think it made the hoity-toity Roman citizen, huge-egoed Saul of Tarsus feel to have this carpenter's son, this lowly carpenter's son, receive all the attention when he, Saul of Tarsus, born Roman citizen, when he was a student of Gamaliel, and yet he didn't receive any acknowledgement. He didn't receive any notice. He didn't receive any praise. What would that do to the ego of a person such as Saul of Tarsus? What would that do to the mental state of a person such as Saul of Tarsus? Do you think he might remember it? Do you think he might keep his eye on this Jesus fellow? Do you think he might look him up from time to time in the future? How fascinating is this? How fascinating is this that Jesus and Paul did meet, and Paul was pretty upset and jealous over the results of that meeting. How's that for some historical context on the interaction between the two most famous figures of the New Testament? And everybody's always told you, oh, Paul never met Jesus till the Damascus Road. Well, wait till we talk about that. Folks, you've been lied to. And as Mark Twain says, it's much easier to convince people of a lie than it is to convince them they've been lied to. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to stop trying. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian whistleblower. We'll be back tomorrow with more paradigm shifting, camel back breaking, apple cart upsetting info. And until then, I'm wishing you peace and light.
Stay connected with the largest spiritual network on the planet, www.imnck.com. On Facebook, Jeffrey Daugherty and Jeffrey Daugherty Show. And on Twitter at NCCabala. Visit imnck.com today and learn how to create yourself and live the life you'll love.